Well, I might as well tell you now as later that I've got a cold. Therefore, we will have to ask your indulgence if the Greek gets a little flat or something of that nature. We have a very interesting subject, however, and one which I believe has been rather generally neglected. And to begin with, naturally our interest lies in Greek religion and philosophy. We must therefore realize that modern man, Western man in particular, knows very little about Greek religion, although he has some knowledge of Greek philosophy. The reason he knows almost nothing of Greek religion is because he has assumed that Greek mythology is Greek religion, and this is not true. We must begin to separate these values clearly in our own thinking. Greek mythology has come down to us as a wonderful collection of fables. Many of them, like the fables of Aesop, with considerable moral and ethical significance. Some of them, like the great epics of Homer, so stately that they seem for a moment to be scriptural. And we have difficulty in not recognizing or accepting in them the deepest convictions of a people. But the fact remains that these epics, these poems, and these dramas are not Greek religion. We must also point out that of all peoples known to us, the Greeks matured in a somewhat different way from nearly any other culture group. If Greece attained distinction among men, it was largely as the result of a conspiracy of efforts arising within the Greek consciousness itself. Actually, the Greek civilization was created by artists. It was created by musicians, dramatists, mathematicians. It was created by philosophers and even artisans. And all these together created Greek religion. Religion came from the motion of the people rather than heavily bestowed by some strange and distant power or circumstance. Therefore, I think we should bear in mind that when we think of gods and refer to the Greeks, we must not fall into our own semantic trap and assume that their gods were like our gods. On the other hand, we must not fall into another dilemma, which even dear old Dr. Schweitzer seems to have fallen into. Namely, that there must be a similarity between our gods and the gods of other men, or else the other men have no gods. That is another mistake. Too common, too easy for us to accept. Actually, our theology is peculiar to our own culture. Greek religion was peculiar to Greek culture. And we were not only unfortunate in the necessity for translating Greek into Latin, and finally Latin into a rather horrible medieval English, we were further unfortunate in the fact that the translators, step by step of this procedure, were almost all against their subject. It was very essential to them to, as they formed this literary bridge between two cultures, to discredit the spiritual attainments of the non-Christian world. The Greeks were pagans, and their translators and their perpetuators were not of kindred belief. Thus, while men gladly and happily accepted Greek art and culture in many ways, and were proud to buy Greek statuary or have their children educated by Greek tutors, they did not want to touch or mention the horrible subject of Greek religion. Thus, Greek religion fell upon evil times the very process of its descent from ancient to modern days. Now, when we speak about Greek religion now, what are we actually talking about? We are talking about a people without a creed. Now, that is something that's hard for us to understand. A people without a Decalogue, or a Sermon on the Mount, or without an Old Testament, or a New Testament. A people without what we would term a messianic revelation. A people who never heard of the idea of religious intolerance. A people who did not recognize or realize that they could be orthodox or unorthodox. My, what blessed problems they escaped. A people, as one writer has pointed out, that could persecute a man for 10,000 reasons, but religion was never one of them. And because of this attitude, what was the religion of a Greek who was perfectly satisfied to let any man believe as he pleased? To our day, he would be lukewarm, lacking in real ecclesiastical zeal, and would be a very bad evangelist for any creed. But the Greek was not evangelizing anything. His religion was a strangely abstract quality in his life. Perhaps one of the reasons why he found no reason to defend it is because it was impregnable in its own right. It was not something that had to be saved every weekend, nor was it something in which religion itself was always trying to save someone else every weekend. The Greek religion was grounded so deeply in the life of the people that it was like the very air of the Hellenic states. It was theirs by birth. They did not claim it, they did not oppose it, they did not offend it, they did not defend it. They simply accepted it as an essential part of their own lives. Another point, of course, is that from a very early period, Greek religion was principally celebrated through mysteries or rituals. These mysteries bore no resemblance to the churches that we have today. There were great religious monuments, but these were memorials. These were raised in homage. They were not places of common day worship. They were sanctuaries built in honor, veneration, or respect for the spiritual virtues of certain deities which have been recognized in the life of the people. Therefore, not going to church as we idealize religion. The Greek was much like some of the Asiatic peoples. Sanctuary was always available to him. He could go any time he wanted to, and he could sit quietly or kneel quietly in a holy place and have communion with himself. No one bothered him, no one talked to him. His religion was between him and his God. If he asked for help, there were priests to attend him, or to prepare certain sacrifices that he might desire to have prepared. But if he wished to be alone and commune with his God, no one asked him why or what was the purpose of his visit. They did not ask him his faith. If he was a Hindu and wished to be in the Greek temple, it was enough that he wished to be there. There was no discussion, and never an effort to try to convert him from some other faith to theirs. Now, we would say that such a religion would hardly have much vitality, but it had a very strange vitality. First of all, it was lifted above every pettiness by which we create controversy and gradually corrupt the overtones of our religious beliefs. Men did not belittle it, berate it. They could not write histories of it or read histories of it written in blood. These things were separate, distinct, and apart. And, of course, behind it all was this wonderful system of religious mysteries. Those who made religion their principal problem in life retired to the study of sacred arts and sciences. Here they passed through something resembling our university training. And after from 10 to 20 years of specialized training, they might either be attached to a religious house, a temple, a shrine, or something of that nature, or they might become philosophers and create schools and gather disciples around them. But these religious leaders did not preach religion, because they received their spiritual insight under obligation, under vows of silence. And it was the Greek way in religion never to talk about it, always to practice it, to reveal it only by what you do. Therefore, when a great and beautiful temple was built, no one talked about the God. No one talked about why it was built. Men simply were still and permitted the beauty of the place to tell them its own message. And in this beauty and harmony and sublimity of atmosphere, they felt their religion and were content. Thus we have something that is rather hard for us to bridge across the centuries and appreciate. We have to, however, go a little further into this matter. We not only have to make a broad statement such as we have made, but we must try to defend it, demonstrate it, or prove it. A study of Greek literature, art, and theater will easily demonstrate the fact of it. But we have other problems that must also be reconciled. Our first consideration is, therefore, what did the Greeks really know about anything? How are we to estimate the place of Greece in the descent of human knowledge? We are a little afraid of the individual who praises constantly, and we are equally frightened of the individual who belittles continuously. Neither can always be telling the truth. Therefore, how are we to estimate? Was the Greek emerging from barbarianism? How did his culture and civilization compare with ours? How far have we progressed since his time? What do we know that he did not know? What did he know that we have forgotten? How shall we measure him in terms of a human being? Fortunately, we have a fairly detailed picture of Greek life. We know their habits, their foods, their activities, their policies, and their politics. We know almost as much about them as we know of contemporary nations on the opposite side of the world, perhaps more, because we have made this study part of Western culture. We must realize, before we get through, that in the age of Pericles, slightly before and slightly after this critical period in Greek thought, covering the period, say, from the 7th century before Christ to about the 2nd century after Christ, that during this long interval of years, Greek culture ruled the world. Greece itself has always been a symbol of a kind of learning. It has always represented wisdom. And most of our concepts of knowledge have originated in Greek terms, Greek symbols, Greek concepts. Most of all, perhaps, we are indebted to Greece for the rise of the great philosophical systems which have become in their turn the foundations of modern science. When we read the writings of Plato or Aristotle, Socrates or Euclid, we know that we are not reading the writings of a novice. We are reading the writings of a highly mature human being. We are reading words and thoughts that we must ponder even now, after nearly 2,500 years. We read in these writings thoughts, ideas that have dawned upon us within the last 5 years. We recognize, therefore, that our Greeks were in general able to produce outstanding creative intellects, outstanding in a way somewhat different from ours. We have builded well, but we have builded upon foundations set forth by others. Among these Greeks, there were builders who created their own foundations, who gave us the principles which we have since been able to apply to innumerable ends. We have today countless mathematical formulas, but the Greeks apparently gave us mathematics. We have many, many chemical formulas. But the Greeks gave us the great concepts behind these formulas. The same way in medicine and art. We've had many great artists in the world, but the Greek canons of art have never been entirely excelled. Thus we have in the period we call the Age of Pericles in Greece, estimated at 500, conservatively speaking, of the world's greatest original thinkers living together in a span of 300 years. If we scattered these thinkers out over 2,500 years, we would still feel that we were living in a period of extraordinary enlightenment. But here we have these immortals compressed into a few centuries, leaving an imperishable mark upon practically every form of knowledge that we know. We therefore cannot regard these as children, nor can we assume that they were stupid followers of stupid leaders. We cannot read the Statesman and Republic of Plato without realizing that we are dealing with a statesman, that we are dealing with a person to whom the problems of our day would not be unfamiliar, and that many of the principles set forth by him must either ultimately be adapted and adopted, or else our way of government will collapse. We have not outgrown these pioneers. We have simply come to ride over them and accept as immediate heroes those who have cribbed from the earlier authors. But actually, when we look back, we can say Greece was like the very contour of its land. Parts of it were low, and somewhere in the height and high parts of it rose the Olympian peaks, which reached practically into heaven and were the abodes of the gods. I think we must admit that a modern man has diversified the advantages of culture far more than the Greeks did. The Greek had his heroes, he had his wise men, but he had his slaves. Today, man has slowly brought knowledge as far as possible to nearly all members of cultured groups. And where the knowledge is not inadequate, it is being improved until it will be. Whereas in those days, knowledge was rested in small groups. This we know. This was the way of that time. But we cannot forget that the citizen of Athens was undoubtedly a brilliant, gifted person, capable of careful and sincere thought, possessing many natural virtues and all the common vices that we have inherited with the virtues. Well, we do recognize that the Greek was a mature person. He was no more a child than we are. He was no more an adolescent than we are. And that the few hundred years that have elapsed since the rise and fall of Greek culture have not changed the essential picture of human life to any marked degree. Undoubtedly, we will for long be indebted to Sophocles, Empedocles, and men of that nature. We will have Aristophanes. We will have the great playwrights, the great poets, the great epic thinkers. And we will recognize the genius of these men. And we will know that they could not have lived in a wilderness, because genius must arise in an atmosphere in some way compatible and suitable to its own production. If then these people were not barbarians, unless we likewise wish to be considered barbarians for the same offenses, then it is difficult to imagine that they would have permitted their religion to fall into the common mythology which we know. We find the poets making use of mythological terms. We find the dramatists doing likewise, and even the philosophers and the statesmen. Yet as we study these terms and the uses of them in drama, we must be careful that we do not assume that these dramatic usages shall be regarded as the highest and fullest and most complete statement of ideas, for they are not. We cannot afford to be in the position that we might be in sometime, 2,000 years from now, if someone should look around and say, yes, the American man, Western man in the 20th century, had three gods he devoutly worshipped and built temples for, and among others he worshipped a dove, which he called the Holy Ghost. Now this would not be true, yet it could well arise in our thinking. It could arise in the thinking of future man. If we wish to belittle the beliefs of others, we can do it in that way. Yet with mature thought, we would know that such could not be the intention. And we know that the people of Greece did not intend to assume that their myths and legends were a true and proper statement of their religions and philosophies. These legends and fables had accumulated as folklore from the innumerable provinces and tribes that finally met together to form the ultimate state of the Greek Confederation. These various groups had their old legends, their wonderful accounts, which associated with every area of their land, just as we have the legends of the Rhine, or we can find a defined group of legends along the Mississippi River. If we can't find any others, we can find the ones Mark Twain left there. We can also find legends among our American Indians. We can find them everywhere. But these legends amuse the children and are a constant source of conversation, but are not the sober expression of our sincere and most earnest thinking. Yet because they were so used as a kind of alphabet, as these religious emblems and symbols certainly meant something in particular to the people of their own time, it is probably well for us to go a little further in this, because we are actually dealing with a kind of emblematic alphabet, a kind of language which perhaps originated in the mystery system itself, so that those who knew could communicate ideas under names. Those who did not know could not penetrate the inner form of the story. Thus we have religious allegory. We have simple statements used to conceal great and wonderful truths. Nor should we assume for a moment that this was limited to the Greeks. But we find it referred to definitely in the New Testament, where Jesus himself makes use of the allegory form, where he says, "This is the parable. The seed is the word of God." He is therefore not talking about a plant in the earth, but of something else, using a simple figure to represent it. The Greeks had long mastered this art, which perhaps they borrowed from the Egyptians, who had known it before them. Thus we cannot assume that these Greeks were quite as naive as we think they were. As a strengthening point in favor of our position, let us think now in terms of the great cosmogonists and cosmologists among the Greeks, to see if we can discover evidences to support the idea that they were persons of discreet mind and proper learning in their own right. Probably one of the best of these ancient writers was Hesiod, who has left us the Great Theogony, which is the story of the creation of the universe and of the gods and of mankind. This poem, for it is a magnificent epic in itself, with much of the grandeur of Homer and a tremendous power of reason and thought, sweeps through the entire mystery of creation. And it does so setting forth certain great and eternal principles. And if these principles are set forth allegorically, certainly we must admit that the same had to be true in the opening chapters of Genesis, which we cannot expect to have everyone take literally. Hesiod gives us a wonderful sweep of Greek creative religious thought. And we must also bear in mind the contribution of Pythagoras of Samos, who was perhaps one of the first to explore the order and arrangement of the solar system. We know now that Pythagoras, 600 years before the beginning of the Christian era, taught heliocentric astronomy. That is, knew that the planets moved around the sun, something for which men much later were burned at the stake. We also realize that Pythagoras was a magnificent mathematician, astronomer, physicist, that he was a musician, a musicologist of excellence. This man was not a follower of old folklore, but a great scholar in his own right. We also have the tremendous documents of Plato and Socrates relating to universal order, and the final gathering of all these principles together by the Neoplatonists of Alexandria and Athens. From the study, therefore, of the serious writings of these people, we realize that they had a profound understanding of the structure of the universe, of the nature of man, and of many other things. That such understanding would be in complete conflict with the idea that they actually and factually believed that the Olympian court was held on the top of a mountain, and that the gods and goddesses engaged in the various banquetings and activities with which we so generally and humanly associate them. Such is simply not conceivable. And the sooner we wake up to this, the sooner we will begin to recognize the latent possibilities in Greek mythology as a clue to forms of basic learning. Following in the works, therefore, of Plotinus and Proclus, the Platonic successors, basing their terms also upon Hesiod, and to a measure upon Homer. But in Homer, the religious factors are very largely subordinated, although the entire work has tremendous formular meaning, if you wish to go into the rituals and search for that meaning. If we wish to leave aside for a moment these things and go on to our search for core, we must therefore pause with the Orphics, the followers of the Thracian bard Orpheus. Orpheus is a very mysterious person who it is almost impossible to date. Perhaps he lived sometime between the 9th and 14th centuries B.C. He came from a distant place, and he brought with him a mystical religion, which he gave to the Greeks. The original meetings of these Orphic rites were nocturnal, held in secret places, and associated with music, the dance, and poetry. The hymns of Orpheus are among the most precious monuments of literature. But this Orpheus, strange, obscure though he may be, was the one who first apparently revealed to the Greeks the internal mystical content of their basic folklore, and perhaps opened to them the psychological doors of their own inner lives. It was only after the rise of the Orphics that Pythagoras and Plato could have lived, and could have taught as they did teach, because the principal contribution of Orpheus was this pressure toward inquiry, the desire for man to recognize that things had more meanings than were obvious, and that beneath the surface of all religious structure, folklore, legend, and the like, there are secret meanings, meanings arising in human experience, meanings arising in human interpretation of legend and fable, and that the search must be for the substance and not the shadow, for the internal truth and not the external appearance, and that all these fables had to be opened as with keys, and their inner structures and bodies revealed to those capable of accepting the proper instruction. So the Orphics made possible the rise of our investigation of Greek religion. And this Greek religion was probably best exemplified by its philosophers, by its great scientific and intellectual leaders, and was best emotionally pressed upon the people by the great dramatists, poets, architects, and those who served the mysterious power of the cult of beauty, which was so powerful in the Greek way of life. In the Greek consciousness, God was ever revealed by man through beauty. Man, therefore, creating the appearance of beauty or releasing beauty, was forever serving deity. The priest of God was the one who served the beautiful. And beauty might be of the intellect, it might be of the emotions, it might be of the body, it might be of harmony and order. Whatever this beauty might be, it must be served, for it is the divine in all things. To go to the Greek religion, therefore, it may be best, perhaps, to conceive of it as a kind of extensive monadology. The monadology of Baron Wilhelm von Leibniz is indicative of this subject. Monadology is a concept that all things exist in the form of monads or of totalities. The totality or unity is always the total sum and substance of a thing. And that, as Leibniz points out, all things are in themselves monadal. That is, they are wholenesses. They are units within units, or surrounded by other units. And just as matter is composed of an infinite number of minute, invisible particles, each in itself complete, although it combines to create a substance dissimilar in appearance to the elements producing or causing it, still, this monadology means that all things arise from unities or inunities, and that therefore there is a master plan behind everything in nature. And that master plan is totality, wholeness, unity, oneness, or as Pythagoras calls it, the monad. And it is from the Pythagorean term, the monad, that the monadology concept arose. The monad, according to Pythagoras, is the one in terms of the total, or the all. The monad is different, therefore, from the unit. And there is this same difference as between unity and unit. A unit is one. A unity is one. But the unit is a one separate or dissimilar from other things. A unity is a one which is a total of all other things in itself. Therefore, the monad is the one in the terms of wholeness. It is the one in the terms of that to which there can be no second, anytime, anywhere. That there can be no duality involving two totalities. The Greeks at an early day of their thinking came to the realization that the root of existence lay in a one for which there was no two. And how to explain this and to discover it rested with Pythagoras. He said, certainly we have diversity, we have number, we have many. We say many from one. But let us follow the Greek thought and say many in one. Because in the Greek concept, the primary monad is never divided. It may allow or permit a certain division within itself, but of its own nature it is always forever one. All the confusion and diffusion of life, things scattered to innumerable extremes and extremities, still must bear witness to the fact that the one is undivided. This one, therefore, is a kind of total in which all things exist substantially, and essentially. And to this one, which is the primal or eternal monad, the Greeks assigned the concept of God. Anyone who assumes that the Greeks were not aware of one deity is mistaken. All you have to do is read your Plato and Socrates to know that this is not so. For they were fully aware of the existence of one deity. The difficulty lay in the fact that they were so aware of this mystery that they declared it profitless to attempt to explain it. That this totality is best understood and best conceived if we make no effort to interpret it. The mere fact that it represents totality or unity or wholeness is as far as we can go. For the moment we go further, we must take away something. If we say that it has any attributes, we are immediately denying that it has certain other attributes. For if we say it is tall, then we say it is not short. If we say it is old, then we say it is not new. If we say it was begotten, then we must say that it can end. Therefore, any way in which we attempt to define it must deprive it of some of its attribute. So the concept of monad, or totality, was perhaps not an incorrect one for the primary of Greek thinking. This primary they regarded, therefore, as all-inclusive. Everything that could exist anywhere, not only in this solar system, but in the most abstract dimensions of cosmos, both quantitative and qualitative. Not only on this line of the continuum, but on any other line of the continuum. All these things that exist, have existed, or may exist at some future time, and all things in the process of transition from one state to another state, moving from that which is known toward that which is unknown, all the reverse. All these things abide as attributes of monadal unity. Nothing can be a surprise. Nothing can be new. Nothing can come from nothing. Nothing can go to nothing. Everything eternally is. Conditions change. Principles do not change. A thing which appears to disappear merely retires from an objective to a subjective state, but its substance is not different. Anything which appears to come from nowhere, but nothing can come from nowhere. Therefore, space or emptiness, as we know it, cannot be space and it cannot be empty. Actually, therefore, we live within a total monadal substance, of which its primary attribute, cognizable to us, is infinite potential. There is no limit to what it can be. There is no way of measuring what it has been. There's no way of solving really what it is. But whatever thing has been, is, or will be, has always existed within it, as the oak tree has always existed within the acorn. And within this magnificent, total, monadic unity, all qualified existence rises and falls, begins and ends. But that which is this monadal substance cannot rise or fall, cannot begin or end, and is referred to by Plato as the eternal animal. An animal from anima, meaning the animated being, or the eternal world soul, crawling forever through space. Having bestowed upon this, therefore, one peculiar power, the Greek felt he had done about all he could. He had bestowed upon this all, the term all. It is everything. It is not a being, nor is it not a being. It is not a place, nor is it not a place. It may be considered as an energy, as a substance, as an essence, as a principle, as a force, as a law, as a substance. In all these things you are naming aspects of it. But you cannot string enough words together to name the substance of it, for it is the essence behind all aspects. Therefore, to say that it is alive would not be truly true, because then it would be susceptible of death, or death could exist. It is not alive in the sense that it was never not alive, or it will ever cease to be alive. It is. It exists. The Egyptians called it Tat, T-A-T, from which we have our word that, T-H-A-T. It is that. Whatever you look at, wherever you turn, whoever's face you gaze into, that is that, with a capital T. Wherever you see, you are seeing nothing but the substance of essence. You are seeing nothing but the extension of this divine thing. Now, the Greeks did not call it divine, because to them, this in itself was an artificial designation. The moment you'll call something divine, you set up a contrary situation, or what the Hindu has with his Shaktis, or polarized divinities. If you say God is divine, then something else is not divine. If you say this deity is better than all other deities, then you again make a mistake, because we are dealing not actually with moral levels. We are dealing with reality, with plain, unvarnished reality, thing as it is. And consequently, this thing as it is has a virtue of reality. And the virtue of reality is greater than the virtues of right or the vices of wrong. Things may be right or wrong, but reality is. And this beingness of reality is beyond all controversy, beyond all classification as we know such possible terms. So in finding or searching for a word, or a phrase, or a term suitable for this, the philosophers, and to a measure at least the Orphics, came upon a simple statement for this particular level, this total monadal essence. They called it the principle of principles. They said of it that it is a principle because it is first. Also that it is a principle because it is an archetype, or a rule, or a law, or a guide, by means of which all other things are. It is forever revealing itself through its works, and the revelation is always a revelation of principles. Everything, therefore, that moves according to its own nature, and this the divine nature, is forever revealing its principles. Therefore, this energy, this eternal power, is the principle from which arises all principles as we know them in terms of law, or energy, or substance, or classifications, or categories, or concepts, or any division we wish to make, intellectual or material, in the forms and structures of nature. So this vast principle of principles, to these peoples, was sovereignty. It neither loved nor hated. It neither was for nor against. It existed forever in its own nature, forever fulfilling its own nature. And therefore everything which it did of itself and by itself, and because of the principle of principles by which it operated, everything so done, so produced, so engineered, so manifested, had to be good, because there can be no other principle in nature. The Greeks were totally unaware of any anthropomorphism, or any battle between eternal good and darkness. Their principles of evil, so-called, or their evil beings, were simply passing chimera, little incidents that arose in the tyrannies of men, or in the peculiar testings of providence. They had no major principle that could stand against the principle of good. It did not occur to them that such a thing could exist, because of what would this adversary be composed? It could only be composed of the substance of the one. It could only have the mind of the one. It could only have the emotions of the one. And possessing all these things in vast measure, how could it revolt against its own similar? Therefore, they had no presumption of this nature. They had no fallen angel. They had no lapsed kingdoms. They simply recognized that man and nature, in their various relationships, would occasionally stumble along for lack of insight. This stumbling they would call evil. But evil is simply man's ignorance of the truth. It has nothing to do with the substance and essence of being. Evil is man's misuse of the principle, through ignorance or through selfishness. And as a result of misuse, the principle, instead of working with him, turns against him, or seems to do so. It does not move at all. He has turned against it by the misuse of its principles. This results in the good appearing to be bad. But as soon as the wayward one has corrected himself and gone back in line, the bad then appears to be good again. These things are forever moving and changing. So we have at the beginning this eternal monad. And the Greek poets, now coming to the aid of the philosophers and the various scholars of different calibers, tried to understand the nature of this principle of principles. And they frequently referred to it as all-present night. They often referred to it as darkness. Not the darkness of man's concept, but the darkness from which light was born. Because lights flare up and disappear, but the great mother night goes on forever. And it is in this mother night, or in this great sovereign darkness, that the principle of principles has its proper abiding place. Not only because this darkness appears to be the lack of light, but more correctly and completely, this darkness is man's lack of insight, whereby it is impossible for him to apperceive that which is concealed within the substance of cause. So of this great principle of principles, man is forever dark, because this is wrapped in its own inscrutability, which is the great night, and the great darkness that envelops all things, and in which all light has its day. But in turn and in time, night returns. So the Orphics wrote beautiful hymns to gracious night, the mother of gods and men, the mother of all creatures that exist in time and space. And they also assumed that this great mother is the monad, the great ripe or fertile power, which is forever dividing within itself, causing within its own great ellipse, within its own tremendous structure, the whole phenomena of existence to take place as upon a mighty stage. When the Greeks began to contemplate this mystery, they realized that it began in its own inscrutable self, in its own nature, and that there existed first, as Pythagoras points out, that from the monad, which is the inscrutable principle of principles, there must emerge the possibility of duality. Duality is an attribute of the monad. The monad is capable of division, but never of being divided. In other words, two is the one in term of halves. The one stands. The two rises within it. And it may be, as Pythagoras pointed out, that the two may gobble up the one, eat it, devour it, as the gods ate their own children. Why? Not because of any tendency to destroy it, but because in the presence of the two, the one disappears. we suddenly see duality, and we hear about unity. And because duality is visible and unity is invisible, the philosophy built upon duality eats up the philosophy built upon unity. Just as we say today, cooperation is the most desirable of all states. This is unity. Competition is the most practiced of all conditions. This is duality. And we say, yes, cooperation is a beautiful idea, but competition is a fact. The two has eaten up the one, because the weight of reality has moved to the two. Competition is a fact. Unity is something we wish it might be. What we do not realize is that unity remains always as the only reality. And all the things that appear to be different from unity are to that appearance difference vanity. But we are unable to know this. But unity giving birth out of itself or within its own nature, for this unity is a great womb which encloses creation. And the embryo which is creation is born within it. And actually, when it is born into existence, it is still born within it, because it is born like the Hindu universe within the womb of the great Mother Miru. So, in the Greek concept, the duality arises within the substance of eternal duration, or eternity. And the substance division which takes place, as Pythagoras says, in the duad. And whenever speaking the number 2 or referring to the duad, he spat upon the ground, because it was the beginning of illusion. The moment you believe there are 2, you can believe there are any number. And the moment you cease to believe there is only one, in that moment you pass from wisdom to ignorance. Because all ignorance rests upon the belief that there is 2 or more. And to recover from that ignorance is not easy. So Pythagoras thought you should emphasize the point rather graphically. In any event, the duality, according to the Greeks, resulted in the emergence out of or within the eternal principle of principles 2 peculiar abstractions, which they call ether and chaos. Now, ether, as the term may apply, is a kind of nutritious vapor, a kind of life substance. It is a substance which has an energy element within it. It is also what was called by the Platonists the bound. Ether had a place. It had a kind. It had a condition. And against it was polarized its opposite, chaos. And the firstborn of eternal light was a twin birth of ether and chaos. Sometimes ether is referred to in the Orphic hymns as eros, or love. Sometimes it is love and the winds that were first born. But ether represents more than love as we know it, for it represents the nutritional tenderness of life, forever supporting and sustaining. And chaos represents the abyss, the pathos of being, the hyle, the meaningless or terrible confusion of things. Therefore, we have the universe divided now into 2 principles, the bound and the infinite. Bound being ether, the infinite chaos. But this is now infinite in the term of infinite confusion. Here is the greatest conceivable number. Chaos is the greatest conceivable number, which means the greatest conceivable illusion. Every number but 1 being an illusion. The greater the number, the greater the illusion. An infinite number becomes infinite illusion, as opposed to infinite truth. And out of this also comes the bound, or ether, which becomes the one and the numbers, emerging out of the monad, or the numeration. So one, or ether, is the number as first, the first of many, the father of multitudes. And the multitudes are the extension of these powers into various expressions of activity. Then, like the Druids, who may have derived some of their knowledge from this, the Greeks believe that the bound and the infinite, that is, the stress or pressure between the one and the many, resulted in a whirling motion, which was called a kind of nebula, a spiral whirling in space. And that from this whirling there was gradually formed the structure of a great egg. And this egg was a kind of second world. And this egg was patterned after the principle of principles, in the sense that it was an enclosing thing. But unlike the principle of principles, it was already enclosed within that. So this was a kind of internal egg within the great sphere of ageless and eternal time. And this whirling sphere, composed of bound and infinite, plus minus, reduced the whole equation to a mathematical formula. And then, as this reached a certain degree of intensity, or densification, the egg broke. And from the egg burst the great deity Phaedes. Phaedes is almost exactly the same described figure as that of the cherub of Ezekiel. It is the winged being with the heads of the bull, the lion, the man, and the eagle. And in this tremendous concept, Phaedes represents the revelation, or the objectification, the emergence of the principle of principles in its first modification, its first major descent. It has become now not the principle of principles, but the principle of beings, which is the second aspect of its own nature. And as in the ancient concept, there were always three divisions. Every motion of Greek mythology and Greek philosophy moves upon a triad consisting of a father, a power, and a mind. The father, the power, and the mind. Now, in this particular concept of things, the father is our principle of principles. The power that comes forth from that is the whirling of ether and chaos and the production of the egg. From the egg bursts the mind, Phaedes, radiant with all the attributes from which are to emerge the concept of a rational world. Now, Phaedes, therefore, becomes the principle of principles in its aspect as now the principle of being, and in its further aspect of universal mind. This, however, is divine mind, resting eternally in the principle of principles. Nothing that we have now discussed has been seen by the eyes of man at any time from the dawn of things. These processes took place within the mystery itself, and all that we have is the symbolical description of them. Now, from the great throne which it had established, in the midst of the great field of the egg through which it had broken, it followed the same idea that you find later in the story of Castor and Pollux, who were born from a single egg. And we find now named Uranus. Now, Uranus was actually the father of a triad. He was therefore the first part of the cosmic mind triad. He was the first aspect released by Phaedes, the symbol of universal intellection. Uranus, or Uranus, therefore, was the god of the sky. But actually, he was the deity within whom all other things lived and moved and had their being. For creation must take place within him, as he must function within the next larger area. These monads are always retiring to the center. So Uranus becomes the symbol of a great power. And this tremendous principle of heaven itself has various terms or titles bestowed upon it. It is the omnipotent, inasmuch as nothing that is beneath it can resist it. It is not immortal. They are the knowers. Intelligibles are things that may be by substance known, or may by substance know. In other words, an intelligible deity is one that can be known without the necessity for intellection, or may know without intelligence, as we know the term. Therefore, the intelligibles are those who are known by apperception, or are known by the instinctive consciousness of man himself. Beings that you do not define by thought, but you learn of by experience, by inwardly perceiving the fact, not by ordinary reason or rationalization, but more by mystical experience, by flash of divine insight, as the prophets of old, or the sages, who talked with the great ones, according to the scriptural writings of most people. These are the beings that are known as a direct impact of consciousness, not an impact of intellect alone. So Uranus, the great symbol of heaven, was therefore the master of the great court in which the stars were innumerable courtiers and gods over which he presided. And in this great world which he was master over, there was one thing, however, which he could not master, because he was not immortal. And the thing that everything is a slave to who is not immortal is time. Time, regardless of vastness of duration, destroys ultimately anything that is destructible within time. So Uranus, according to the Greeks, the sky in infinite motion, by the fact that it possessed infinite motivation and mutation within itself, whether it knew it or not, inevitably became a clock. These time mysteries arose out of the very motions of the heavenly bodies themselves. And all of motion immediately creates time interval. Therefore, Uranus was the father of Cronus, who was the symbol of time. Now, Cronus is spelled in two ways, either with a K or with a C. And Cronus spelled with a K is not merely the Greek form of the Latin. The Greeks themselves recognized two forms of the deity, although we use the two forms of spelling as the simplest way of differentiating them. This would not be quite in the Greek way, but it helps us not to confuse the two names. The Greeks recognized a Cronus that represented a principle of time, and then a Cronus that simply represented the movement of time itself. One was the law behind time, and the other was time in its own natural motions. The law behind time is wise and deep and mysterious, but time itself is a despot, the reaper. And those who do not understand the law will hate the manifestation. But those that understand the law will know why the operation of it is the greater good. But man must know the principle or the power behind things in order to become aware of their goodness or their necessity or their nobility. So Cronus becomes now the second aspect of a triad. And of course, remember that each of these triads branches off and has secondary triads dependent upon it, but we cannot pause for those at the moment. We come therefore from Uranus, which is the father of this great intelligible triad. We pass to the second power of it, which is Cronus, the power. For time is the power which rules creation. And then we come to the third aspect, the mind of the triad. And this is Zeus. And we have a triad again established now, representing the primary trinity of powers. The Father, the power of the mind, Uranus, Saturn or Cronus, and Zeus or Jupiter. These three together constitute what might be termed the middle world. And they are divided by the hypothetical time factor. The superior part of this triad pertains to the great cycle of heaven, which is Uranus. The inferior part to Zeus, which is the beginning of the mundane diffusion of things. The second part is Cronus in its own right. Now these three deities together, moving into the human analogy, for all these things apply on innumerable levels, so carefully worked out that it is almost inconceivable. But on the human level, these three represent the psychic field of man. We therefore have man located between three tremendously contending parts of his own nature. We have the psychological emergency created in man by time, the resistance of ambition to time. We find the human soul having its actual terrible journey through time, the seeking to escape time, and the tyranny of mind in the more material sense that we know it in. So we have these three great dynasts that take over the universe. We have Thales, the splendid symbol of cosmic intellect, universal divine mind, creating a world in which this divine mind is divided into three parts. And these three parts may well be represented by the superconscious mind as Uranus, the conscious mind as, in this case, Zeus, and the subconscious mind by Cronus, the peculiar binding factor which holds these things together. For we must realize that in the development of the human mind, the conscious mind, was the last to appear, not in the middle, as might be implied from our placing the term consciousness between unconscious and superconscious. These terms are more or less obsolete in psychology, but they will help us to orient this concept in Greek mythology or Greek religious philosophy. So we have that part of mind which contemplates the nature of reality within itself. And we have Uranus, who, so to say, dreams the creation of the world. The mind which of itself never actually changes, but permeates through into the conditions set up within itself. We have this mind suddenly bound by the limitation of time. We find that which is neither old nor new suddenly becoming old and new. We find time taking up the tyranny over the universe, as represented by Saturn or Cronus. And then we find, in turn, the kingdom taken from Cronus, as Cronus took it from his father, and the kingdom turned over to Zeus. And why was the kingdom in this case turned over to Zeus? simply because in the procedures of these things, they must come out of time, the primary production of mind moving with time, and that is law and order. Consequently, out of the various subjectives and the various mysteries of things arises the demiurgic power, the orderer, the organizer, that which comes forth to make all things possible, to make all things reasonable. Therefore, we have Zeus emerge as human consciousness emerges in the process of maturity. In the Greek philosophy, man as a spiritual being has always a certain divine consciousness natural to him, which would correspond to Uranus. He descends into the mystery of generation, as Narcissus, looking at his image in the pool, falls in and drowns. He then has another kind of mind, the mind of death, the mind of the reaper, or the mind of disillusionment and despair, Saturn or Cronus. And having therefore attained a new position, having ascended to a middle distance between heaven and earth, he then becomes a human mind. And by taking his human mind, he disposes of the phantoms of the superior and the inferior, and locks himself into the true concern of his own kind, which is the appearance of the universe of Zeus. Zeus is called the Demiurgus because he is the secondary leader of the world. He is secondary in the sense that he represents an intellect, that he represents the entire world embodied in a being. And at the moment he appears as such, he immediately has to become a triad also, because he has to be a father, a power, and a mind in himself. And in creating the father, power, and mind triad out of Zeus, the ancients came with the three divisions of the lower world: Zeus Poseidon, and Zeus Hades. These were the three forms of Jupiter. Zeus was the airy power of the mind, Poseidon the watery power of the mind, and Hades the earthy power of the mind. Therefore, Hades also became the symbol of the underworld. And in our understanding of the Greek myths, we realize that Zeus Hades, the lord of the underworld, is actually the ruler of the sublunary sphere of mankind. This world in which we live, not the world into which we may depart at death, but this world in which we live is under the rulership of Zeus Hades. This is his world. This is the world of the dead. Beyond it and around it is a great psychic sphere ruled by Poseidon, which is the abode of heroes. For you will remember that Odysseus was a hero of the order of Poseidon, and for offending the Lord of the Seas, he was sent upon the perilous and terrible journey in which it seemed that the oceans were bent upon his destruction. But Poseidon was the psychic field of the earth, and Zeus was the intellectual or airy atmosphere of the earth. So that the mental world of man is under Zeus, the emotional world of man is under Poseidon, and the physical body of man and his physical empire is under Hades. And these are, as the Greeks call, the three parts of a blessed god. Well, this god is Zeus. Now, how are we to understand the parallel or comparison between this concept of Zeus, in which Zeus is no longer a person at all, with the bearded Olympian Zeus of Phineus, that is probably one, or was one, of the world's most magnificent artistic achievements. The artist was asked that himself many hundreds of years ago, and he replied very simply that it was his purpose to portray something of the magnificence of this mundane mind in which all things that take place do take place. That it was to remind the beholder that this material universe in which we physically exist is not a terrible place, and not a horrible abode of punishment, but is the body of a blessed God, and that it is what we make it to be, but that over it rules an intellect which man may come to feel or to know in some respect by looking up at the great ivory face of the Olympian Zeus, the majesty of it. This is the true majesty of the world, not the majesty of selfish human beings, but the majesty of the plan. This is the face that the physicist looks into when he explores space, or the astronomer. This is the very presence into which we would hurl a satellite. It is this great body whose body nature is, and God the soul. So this Olympian Zeus is our mundane creation. And it is the child born out of the mystery of time, as Einstein so well pointed out, measured by the time of Cronus and the continuum of Uranus. And these are mathematical elements, just as certain as in any equation that can be produced in physics. The thing is, we have thought of them so long as legends that we have forgotten all about the fact that these are the mysterious little characters of a secret alphabet by means of which the most intricate experiments of mankind can be quickly organized and then presented in the form of a charming fable, meaningless to those who are not initiated, but meaningful to those who are. So we have come into this problem of the dynasts. Now why, we will say, in the terms of Greek philosophy, was any part of this necessary? And the Greeks tell us that there is a deity that exists in the very substance of things. And this deity is Themis, the law. And Plato speaks of the universe moving upon the spindle of Themis. That also there is a mysterious power which is called necessity. That necessity is the strange driver or master of many things in nature. In the very ancient and beginning of all of this, when the principle of principles rested sublime and supreme within itself, it possessed within its own nature, archetypally, the three powers that had to come forth from it. It did not cause these powers, according to Greek thinking, to come forth by any conscious or volitional action of the will. The principle of principles, because it contains all things, contains the principles of these powers, innate within itself. For nothing can come from it that is not in it. And the urgency of principles includes the urgency of the inevitable manifestation of that which has the potential of being manifested. So in the Greek system, the manifestation of things is not according to a will, but is according to the innate and intrinsic quality of the thing itself. The acorn does not grow into a tree because it is ordered to do so, nor does it plan beforehand what kind of a tree it is going to be. It possesses the principle of growth, and it is simply true to that principle. And by fulfilling its own inevitable purpose, it becomes in due time a magnificent tree if all the circumstances are propitious. Therefore, creation is a tree with its root in the principle of principles. And this tree grows not by the will of any person, but by the inevitable power of its own principles, that periodically, consistently, according to the great rhythms of existence, the periods of fertility and sterility follow each other in the universe. And periodically, being produces. The principle becomes germinal or fecund in its own nature and causes the emergence of the inevitable qualities. This is not an act of a particular kind, because in a being in which all action is omnipresent at all time, action is as much an inevitable as the transcendency of action. Thus it is eternal rhythm, eternally manifesting itself, that causes these things to occur. And the first to emerge, ether or eros, love, immediately sets all other necessary things in action. For the procedure is gradually downward, until finally the intellect is established. The intellect is not potency in the nature of deity, but potential in the nature of deity. And deity becomes intellectual only through intellectual creations of its own. Therefore, a deity, the principle of principles, which may not know itself, is known by its own progeny, because it is the privilege of the progeny to release these powers. And in the releasing of these powers, there is this eternal growth forever taking place throughout the universe. The releasing of these powers also means the systematic exhibition of the principal powers that are in the nature of the principle of principles. And as this must be a father of power and of mind, we say that the principle of principles in its own nature is the father. In the form of eros, or in the form of ether, it is power, and in the form of chaos, it is mind. For mind begins with the chaos of ignorance and must conquer it. And the rising up of the demiurgus, or Zeus, is the final victory of the mind principle over the Titans, which are the remnants of the primordial giants, or the uncontrolled and uncontrollable forces of nature. And in the Greek thinking, it is the tyrant that creates the mind. It is the peril of the being which forces the emergence of its own consciousness. Now the Greeks, for one reason which we are not too sure of, apparently did not use the term consciousness. They have no equivalent for it in Greek. So that what we would term this conscious part of man, they cover under one form of intellection or another, having a series of different types. Their term intelligible, as contrasted to intellectual, would come very close to our concept of consciousness. Consciousness, again, however, with them, always implies consciousness which knowing creatures bestow upon unknown objects or conditions. Therefore, we look up into the ethereal diffusion. We cannot see Zeus seated upon his Olympian throne anywhere in space around us, any more than we can find the concept of our God in space as he appears on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. We cannot find this old man throwing out the sun in front and the moon behind. He is something we cannot explain in terms of fact. But in the Greek thinking, we explore with our own mind the cause of phenomena. And when we gradually isolate this thing which lies at the root of what we are and what we do, we come up, as Sir James Jeans came up, with the concept of a world mind. We say there has to be an intelligent power at the root of things. And because we have observed this need, we then create Zeus, just as Phineas created him. We create him because he is necessary. Therefore, we say with the Greek that there is a peculiar deity called necessity, and that this peculiar deity is a gadfly that is forever going on to all achievement and all things that man does. We come to the conclusion, as Jeans came, that the hypothesis of an intellectual agent at the root of life is necessary. There is that very term coming in. We cannot explain other things without this hypothesis. And to the Greek, we cannot explain the universe without the hypothesis of Zeus. Having therefore come to this hypothesis, we must then explore it. And in the common parlance of the arts, it would be very difficult for us to imagine a moral force which we could not enrich with a personality, dramatize, and associate with the various values of life. So the Zeus we know, like the Olympian Zeus, is carved by our own genius, invested with our own attributes, not because we have invented it, but because we have discovered it to be necessary. That is the peculiar point of their philosophy, that the exploration of space is the continuous discovery of that which is necessary. Now, until we discover it, we do not know that it is there. After we have discovered it, we do not know what it looks like. It is a postulation. Perhaps it is something that is so intangible that we have in the instinctive intent to place it in a remote place to signify its own qualitative remoteness. But we must assume it. We are continually discovering these attributes. We are continually finding our dependency upon monadal units. So we surround our present life with a monad. And we finally call this monad Zeus. And we must struggle with it until we master it, until we discover its nature. Now Zeus, representing the monad, is the lowest aspect of soul and the highest aspect of mind. This is a very interesting mathematical formula also. Man seeking to discover the universe is seeking to master its aspects. He does this by the mysterious and terrible threefold journey of the mysteries. As Orpheus, he must descend into the underworld, which is Hades. And here he has his material existence. And here he would like to save his soul, but he cannot escape the temptation to look back and to fall back again into his own ways, old ways, so that the soul slips away and is lost to him, as in the legend of Eurydice. Then, like the water hero, he attempts the great journey, the Odyssey. Here he explores the mysteries of the ethereal diffusion of the humid life of things. He discovers that souls falling into generation come under the control of Poseidon. He realizes also that the human sphere finally fell into the earthy, or was absorbed into it, which was one of the reasons for the mysterious story of the disappearance of the empire of Poseidonus, or Atlantis. And he discovers that the power of this sphere lies in its emotional content, so that he finds a psychic life, an emotional life, in the humid or liquid psychic field. Then he ascends still further now to discover Zeus himself in his proper nature as pure mind. Pure mind arising in the substance and essence of pure reason. But as reason is greater than mind, so the father of Zeus, Cronus, which is reason, mind plus perfect time. This pattern gives us the next order of deities. So the ancients, the Greeks, regarded Zeus as the peculiar father god. He is mind. Therefore, being mind, it is not purposeful or meaningful that he shall be any better than he should be. The idea that mind was going to wander around in a saintly state of merely inspiring people to do beautiful and wonderful things was too ridiculous for the Greeks to be interested in it. This mind was the mind that they knew. This is mind. The mind that came through to them with all of its vicissitudes and its inconsistencies. And they were perfectly aware of the fact that this mind was a tyrant and was a despot, that this mind was forever ravaging the earth, seducing man into the thoughts and ideas that were unsuitable to his survival, that this mind was a tyrant, always involving divine and human matters, and all the legends of Zeus and his involvements in human affairs are perfectly proper when you realize the Greek says this: the only mind that I know is the mind that I am. If I place any blessedness upon this mind, I am projecting it. But if I move with this mind, I shall discover it. And in the Greek point, therefore, necessity constantly pressed on to the discovery. When man is perfect, he will then come into a concept of a perfect mind. Until then, he cannot. So Zeus is the mind as it is, the mind that plagues us all, the mind that manifests through to us as our politicians, as our warmongers, as our strikesters, shall we call them, at the present time in the food markets. All these things represent the story, the struggle, the conflict, the ups and downs, the good, the bad, the humor, the tragedy. And yet all of this suspended from one point, the despotism of the intellect. Each individual in every one of these situations is right. And because he is right, he is Zeus, sitting on his little throne and doing things that other people do not approve of, but getting away with them because he has the power to do so. Yet this Zeus is not all bad. He is in many ways a very commendable character, because like mind, he makes possible many good things. And he makes possible, among other things, the protection and preservation of Dionysos Zagros, the Savior God. Because it is this mind that out of its own struggles and its own miseries and its own misfortunes also has the strange knack of raising up the heroes, the men who are forgotten, persecuted, martyred in their own day, live on to be remembered. Each human mind is wrong, but the mass of human mind is a little wiser than any part of itself. And we see this constantly. Temporarily we reward the wrong person, but in the long run the false and the true are strangely sifted out. So this mind also, like Zeus, has a ponderous power of justice in the root of itself. And it's this justice that causes Zeus to call in the help of Thetis or Themis, the law, in all these different problems that arise, just as Wotan called upon Erder, the great Earth Mother, for wisdom and leadership in the emergencies of his living. Zeus, then, is not any more peculiar than the principle as we know it for which he stands. Yet he is divine and he is royal, because he is born to us from a superior power. He has been preserved to us by a strategy, for his mother substituted a stone in order that he should not be devoured by his own father. Cronus, in order to prevent the universe from falling into the power of man's mind, devoured all his own children. He did this in the same way that time, it is said, eats up everything that is generated by it. Time devours all of its own progeny. But here we have another phase of a very well-known story about a couple in the Garden of Eden. And this couple was warned that there was certain fruit they should not eat. But they ate that fruit anyway. And the great powers said that they must not eat this fruit, because they would then become as gods, knowing good and evil. Now you would have thought the gods would have wanted them to. Nice, happy, good gods should have wanted that. But instead of that, Adam and Eve were punished. And later, when Prometheus brought the flame in a hollow reed from heaven and gave it to man, giving him the power of internal light, Prometheus himself was punished by being crucified upon a rock of Mount Caucasus, and the vulture placed forever gnawing upon his liver, for which he was ultimately to be saved only by the intercession of Hercules. But in any event, the point of the matter is that mind taking over or usurping the kingdom of Cronus was a very strategic and important thing in Greek thinking. It was mind taking over and conquering the mystery of time. Now, mind taking over or escaping time meant a great deal if we begin to understand it, because man is a time-born, time-bound creature. His little life is rounded with a sleep, and that sleep is measured by time. 60 years and 10, 80, maybe 50, if very fortunate or unfortunate. But usually, time is of the essence of things. In this time tyranny, therefore, mind finds itself allotted a span in which it must achieve. And man, as an individual, has to grow up, mature, enrich his intellect, and become his own Zeus by the conquest of his inferior nature within a time allotment. And against this background of time, the struggle of the mind goes on forever. Yet this same struggle is important to Zeus also, because Zeus forever sought to find the secret of his own time. He tried, like Wotan, to find out the riddle of his own destiny, and he found out all else. But his own destiny he could not solve. And the same problem affects us in every concept that we have today. So mind, which has been called in India the slayer of the real, but is nevertheless absolutely necessary to the discovery of something. Mind leads us finally to the discovery of world mind, and the further discovery that world mind is suspended within the structure of world soul, and that as the human being evolves from hierarchy to hierarchy, the great pageantry of the Greek mythology opens up as a tremendous philosophical document, a document suited to inform him on almost any subject with which he happens to be concerned. Now, if we go now to these three worlds and consider them for a moment, these three together, the world of spirit, the world of mind, soul together, and the world of body, constitute the three great spheres over which diagrammatically and substantially Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus have balanced government. And there we have the triad, the creator, the preserver, the destroyer. We have the great trimuta of the Hindus and the symbol of the number 3. Pythagoras said that triangle, or the first three numbers, are not really numbers but numerals, because they are all symbols of ideas. And the symbols of the three basic ideas reflect themselves as spirit, soul, and body, represent themselves as the three worlds, heaven, earth, and hell, are found, of course, in the triple crown of the Supreme Pontiff of the Roman Church and the triple tiara of the Dalai Lama of Lhasa. Always the Temple of Heaven in China with its three arches, its three domes, the symbol always of the triform universe, a universe in which there is a motion from pure spirit through a psychic mental nature to a physical or material or energy condition. Now, energy in this substance, or in this subject, relates to Poseidon, who represents the sidereal energy of nature. Each of these deities have their own energy fields. These fields are compatible one with another, so that once you learn the master scheme, you can identify it on each and every level. We are told that in this great order of the Dynasty, every power stole its throne from its predecessor. In so doing, we come to another important thing, namely that it is in the involutionary or descending arc of human growth and development that each form of life attains its own individuality by blocking out the memory or knowledge of that which has gone before. If, for example, into this mortal sphere as we know it now, into the world of Zeus Hades, man could bring the memory of his previous state, he could not be captured here. If his memory could go anywhere else, he could not be held here. Nothing that happened here would mean anything to him if he knew more than he knows here. That problem has been brought up in connection with Christian theology for a great many centuries. Namely, could Christ suffer if he was God? Could he suffer on the cross? Could God be crucified in more than an appearance? That is an unsolved mystery. But the point of importance to our thinking is that if inwardly we positively and factually knew more than is necessary to live here, we could not be bound here. Nothing here would make any difference unless it was important while it was happening. And it can only be important because it is bigger than our ability to cope with it, or that it fulfills something that at the moment we regard as important, or that it damages something which at the moment we regard as important. Therefore, our ability to function here depends upon the fact that we do not know enough to escape. Therefore, the gates or doors of the mysteries were kept open in the Greek system in order that human souls could escape from the tyrannies of these various gods and could return again up the ladder of the divinities to the primary cause, as Plotinus explains this to us. But always we must go through the God to reach that which is beyond him. We find this same thought carried in the Christian faith, where the Master is caused to say, "None cometh unto the Father save by me." In other words, you cannot go around the power and evade it. Therefore, in the Greek mythology, the figure of Zeus represented a state of mental individuality that had to be achieved by the individual. He could go no further. He could not say, "I don't like Zeus, I'm going to have nothing to do with him." You can't escape, because Zeus represents the collective monad in which the whole mathematical pattern of your present condition exists. You cannot move until you outgrow the pattern. You cannot escape until consciousness permits you to flow into the next larger monadic unit. To get out, therefore, you must have solved the mystery of the labyrinth. You must have found the Minotaur. And you must have the thread of Ariadne to get out again. This mystery, as in the story of the wanderings of Odysseus, means there can be no victory or no solution until the offended gods have been placated. Therefore, whatever you have done to hurt the gods' feelings or to injure them in some way, you must make it right to escape the final punishment of those deities. And much of your Greek drama is based upon man struggling against the fates of the gods whom he has offended, and also finding ways to seek their forgiveness or to cause them to cease their injury of him. This, of course, is not a personal thing. It is the Greek thinking mind recognizing that the outraged deity is a law offended, that law that has been offended must be placated. The individual must rise to certain problems. And here in your Orphic Mysteries, you find the beginnings of your Doctrine of Atonement. You have the doctrine of the individual who cannot undo what he has done, actually. But he must therefore go through a penance. He must be tested. He must be enslaved. He must become the servant of an outraged deity and fulfill any task that deity requires, until finally he is forgiven for his mistake. These deities are all laws, and every law offended becomes a master to which the lawbreaker is attached as a slave until the law is compensated. The moment the law is compensated and all is right, the slave is liberated. But we are all slaves to the laws we have broken. We are all, to a measure, under the penances of the gods we have offended. But these gods are not persons who don't like us. These gods are the great triune principle of principles, operating on various levels of existence, which through ignorance or perversion we have offended. And by necessity we must correct our mistake. And by themis, which is learning out of this necessity, man ultimately chooses the right, achieves the good, and returns to the divine world from which he came. The romance of the gods descending and of man ascending, these are the burdens of the great Greek drama and the dance and the music and the literature of this people. And I think as we go on with it, we will perceive that it possesses a real and deep interest for us. There are many phases of it which cannot be reconstructed out of the ancient times. But we do know that these people rationalized on these principles, that they gave us the principles of psychology, and that in this psychology, under the heading of Zeus, they personified the whole terrible, troublous monument of the mind. This mind which has plagued us and around which so many psychological systems have later been developed. The problem of mind as the universal tyrant and the private despot, and the victory of man over time, the victory of man over his own emotions and of mind. These are the proper discourses of the mysteries. Because as Apuleius tells us in the Metamorphosis, it is the power or right of the mysti that as he approaches the sanctuary, that he shall behold God face to face in his own true and natural likeness. Which means nothing more nor less than that principles shall be seen in their substance, rather than in their appearances. That the mask shall be removed, because in the Greek drama it was usual for the gods to always be masked. Other characters were also masked, but in the mythologies and in the rituals, the masked gods represented principles concealed behind the appearances that we have created for them. Therefore, we think we see the god, but we see only our own interpretation of the principle. But by the mysteries we behold the gods face to face. We therefore behold the principles, the laws, the rules, the living energies, the eternal substances in their proper and natural appearance and form, and in so doing can no longer be deceived by the falseness of appearances. For that which we have seen through a glass darkly, we shall then see face to face. And all these principles which form the great Greek theology are principles seen by us through a glass darkly. But through the great institution of the mysteries, we shall be permitted to tread upon the threshold of prosody. We shall be allowed to enter into the sanctuary and come into the adytum, where the gods behold us and we behold them face to face. And the Greeks were not sure which would be the most surprised, man or the gods. Because only when man discovers the gods can the gods see man or themselves. It is a very intricate and interesting system, and certainly much more important than mere mythology. Well, I think that's enough.